The commander of the 3rd Armored Division couldn't believe what he was seeing. Scattered across the Belgian countryside in December 1944 were dozens of Panther OSFG tanks, Germany's most feared armored vehicle, sitting abandoned with fuel in their tanks and ammunition in their racks. Some had been driven less than 50 kilometers from the German border. The crews had simply walked away. For American tank commanders who had spent months dreading encounters with the Panther, this discovery seemed impossible. The Panther OSFG, with its 75 MKWK 42L70 gun, could penetrate the frontal armor of an M4 Sherman from over 2,000 meters, while the Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't scratch a Panther's frontal plate beyond 500 meters. Allied intelligence had reported that it took an average of 5 Shermans to knock out a single Panther, with 4 being lost in the process. Why would German crews abandon such a decisive tactical advantage? The answer lay not in combat effectiveness, but in something far more mundane: the Panthers' catastrophic mechanical unreliability and the Wehrmacht's collapsing logistics network. What American forces discovered upon closer inspection of these abandoned behemoths revealed a stunning design philosophy clash. The Panther's Maybach HL-230 P-30 engine, a 700-horsepower marvel of German engineering, required meticulous maintenance every 150 kilometers. Its complex interleaved roadwheel system, designed to distribute the tank's 45-ton weight evenly, became a maintenance nightmare. In winter conditions, mud would freeze overnight between the overlapping wheels, and crews needed hours with blowtorches just to get the tank moving each morning. The final drive, the mechanism connecting the engine to the I-tracks, was dramatically under-engineered for the vehicle's weight. Designed for a 35-ton tank, it was installed in a 45-ton monster. Panthers routinely broke down after just 150 kilometers of operation, with final drive failure being the most common mechanical death sentence. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, more Panthers were lost to mechanical breakdown than to enemy fire. One captured German tank commander from Panzer Lehr Division explained it bluntly to his American interrogators. "Give me a Panzer IV any day. The Panther is magnificent when it works, but it works for 3 days, then sits for a week." The contrast with American design philosophy was stark. The Sherman, often mocked by its own crews as a Ronson lighter, though this nickname was actually a post-war invention, was built with an entirely different priority: operational availability. Its Continental R975 radial aircraft engine was simple, widely understood by mechanics, and could run on almost any fuel. The transmission could be pulled and replaced by a crew in the field in under 2 hours. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. During the Third Army's dash across France in the summer of 1944, Patton's M4 Shermans maintained an operational readiness rate above 90%. Meanwhile, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps reported that fewer than 40% of their Panthers were combat-ready at any given time, even when spare parts were available. The abandoned Panthers American forces found during the Ardennes offensive told the complete story. Germany's fuel situation had become so desperate that tank units received barely enough diesel to reach their jumping-off positions. When a Panther's final drive failed 20 kilometers into the offensive, as they inevitably did, there was no recovery vehicle, no spare parts, and no fuel to bring them back. The crews removed the breech blocks from the main guns, destroyed the radios, and walked east. One particularly revealing incident occurred during the siege of Bastogne. The 116th Panzer Division reported 12 Panthers as combat losses, but post-battle inspection revealed that 7 had been abandoned due to mechanical failure. 3 had run out of fuel within sight of American positions, and only 2 had been knocked out by enemy fire. This mechanical fragility had a cascading effect on German tactical doctrine. Panther units couldn't conduct the kind of rapid, sweeping maneuvers that characterized mobile warfare. They became essentially defensive weapons, positioned in ambush positions where their superior guns and armor could shine. But this static deployment surrendered the initiative entirely to the Allies, who could choose when and where to attack with numerical superiority. The revelation fundamentally changed how the U.S. Army approached armored vehicle design. The post-war M26 Pershing and subsequent M46 Patton tanks incorporated a crucial lesson. Mechanical reliability wasn't a secondary consideration to firepower and armor. It was equally important. Soviet designers, who had always prioritized simplicity in their T-34 series, felt vindicated in their philosophy. Perhaps the ultimate irony came in March 1945, when the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Among the German armor defending the Rhine's east bank were 37 Panthers. Within 3 days of heavy combat, 23 had broken down mechanically. American forces destroyed 2 with bazooka fire and captured 12 fully functional tanks that couldn't move under their own power. The Panthers, abandoned across Europe, stand as monuments to a harsh military truth. On paper, superiority means nothing if your weapon can't reach the battlefield, can't stay in the fight, and can't be sustained by your logistical network. Sometimes the best tank isn't the one with the biggest gun, it's the one that shows up. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov of the 3rd Guards Tank Army stared in disbelief as his veteran sergeant offered a German private 3 tins of American Spam in exchange for a single Iron Cross medal. It was April 1945 somewhere in eastern Germany, and Volkov had just witnessed something that contradicted everything Soviet propaganda had told him about decadent Western food. His battle-hardened tankers, men who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, treasured these rectangular blue and yellow tins more than vodka, more than German watches, more than almost anything else they could loot. The mysterious canned meat product, officially designated Item 10 in Lend-Lease shipments, had arrived in the Soviet Union by the millions of cans starting in 1942. Soviet authorities were initially puzzled by American insistence on sending this particular foodstuff. The USSR had requested tanks, planes, and ammunition. Instead, nearly 15 million pounds of what Americans called spiced ham crossed the Pacific through Vladivostok and the treacherous Arctic convoys to Murmansk. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself would later write in his memoirs, "Without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army." Coming from the man who commanded the defense of Moscow, the siege of Stalingrad, and the final assault on Berlin, this was an extraordinary admission about a product that was the butt of jokes in American mess halls. The revelation that shocked Soviet soldiers wasn't just that Spam tasted better than their standard rations, it was that this single American food product solved nearly every logistical nightmare the Red Army faced on the Eastern Front. Soviet Army rations in SAR 142 were catastrophic. The standard issue was black bread, kasha, buckwheat porridge, and occasionally salted fish or pork fat. But the bread froze solid in winter, becoming inedible rocks that soldiers had to thaw against their bodies. The kasha required cooking equipment and time, luxuries that frontline units rarely had. Meat was theoretically part of the ration but seldom materialized except when soldiers requisitioned livestock from occupied territories. Then came Spam. Each 340-gram tin contained pre-cooked pork shoulder and ham, mixed with salt, water, sugar, and sodium nitrite. It required no refrigeration, no cooking, and could be eaten straight from the can even in -40-degree temperatures. The tins were nearly indestructible. Tankers discovered they could run a T-34 over a case of Spam without breaching a single can. But the truly revolutionary aspect was protein density. A single Spam tin contained 1,080 calories and 42 grams of protein. Soviet nutritionists calculated that 3 tins per week could keep a soldier combat effective indefinitely. Compared to the Soviet alternative, trying to move live cattle behind advancing armies, butchering them in field conditions, and distributing fresh meat before it spoiled, Spam was logistical magic. Tank crews particularly valued Spam because it could be eaten while buttoned up inside their vehicles. During the massive tank battles at Kursk in July 1943, T-34 crews fought for days without leaving their tanks. They learned to punch holes in Spam tins with bayonets and eat the contents without even fully opening the can, a technique that kept metal fragments out of the food during combat. One incident during Operation Bagration in summer 1944 illustrated Spam's psychological value. The first Ukrainian front's supply column was destroyed by German aircraft, leaving 3 tank brigades without food for 4 days. When a single American truck loaded with Spam finally broke through, the divisional commander distributed 1 tin per crew before the next attack. Post-battle reports noted that unit morale and combat effectiveness remained surprisingly high, despite the food shortage, with soldiers later admitting that knowing Spam was coming kept them fighting. The contrast with German rations revealed another advantage. Wehrmacht soldiers received excellent food when supply lines were intact. Black bread, real butter, canned vegetables, and the famous goulash cannon mobile kitchens served hot meals daily. But German rations required intact logistics, field kitchens, and fuel for cooking. As the Eastern Front collapsed and supply lines stretched impossibly thin, German soldiers starved while surrounded by frozen, inedible supplies. Soviet troops discovered this repeatedly when overrunning German positions in 1944-45. They would find warehouses full of flour, dried beans, and raw meat, all useless without the infrastructure to process them. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers carried Spam in their greatcoat pockets, eating it with their bare hands between attacks. The American product even influenced Soviet tactical doctrine. Soviet deep battle theory required rapid, sustained offensives that outran traditional supply lines. Spam made this possible in ways Soviet logistics never could. Tank armies could advance 40-50 kilometers per day because they weren't waiting for field kitchens to catch up. Commanders calculated offensive ranges based on ammunition and fuel, not food supplies, something previously impossible. Perhaps the strangest validation came from an unexpected source. After the war, when Soviet researchers examined German military documents, they discovered that Wehrmacht intelligence had specifically identified Soviet-American food supplies as a critical vulnerability to target. German reports from 1944 noted, "Ivan eats from American tins and fights like he's well fed." Destroy their supply trucks carrying the rectangular cans. The cultural impact persisted long after the war. Nikita Khrushchev, who had been a political commissar during the war, mentioned Spam specifically in a 1963 speech about Lend-Lease contributions. Soviet veterans returning home brought back empty Spam tins which became household items, used for storing nails, buttons, and small parts. The distinctive rectangular shape was instantly recognizable to any Soviet citizen who had lived through the war. By 1945, the Soviet Union had received 2.16 billion pounds of food through Lend-Lease, with Spam representing a significant portion. American military planners had initially questioned whether sending food made sense compared to weapons. The answer came from the battlefield. Well-fed soldiers shoot straighter, advance faster, and maintain morale under conditions that would break starving men. When Lieutenant Volkov finally tried Spam, himself sliced thin and fried over a tank engine manifold, he understood why his sergeant valued it so highly. It wasn't just food. It was the taste of an army that could keep fighting regardless of what the enemy destroyed behind them. Sometimes the most important weapon isn't fired from a gun, it comes from a tin. British pilots were amazed when they discovered why Japanese Zeros could outturn every Allied fighter squadron leader. James Ginger Lacey stood beside the captured Mitsubishi A6M20 at RAF Base Eagle Farm in Brisbane, running his hand along the fuselage. The metal felt wrong, thin, almost flimsy, like aluminum foil stretched over a frame. He rapped his knuckles against it and heard a hollow sound that made him wince. This was the fighter that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, the aircraft that could outturn a Spitfire and make a Hurricane look like a lumbering bus. Yet Lacey could literally dent the skin with his thumb. The date was March 1943, and Allied intelligence had finally gotten their hands on an intact Zero after an emergency landing on Akutan Island in Alaska. What they discovered when they flew it, tested it, and tore it apart was so shocking that it fundamentally changed how Western engineers thought about fighter design, and revealed a Japanese philosophy so alien to British and American thinking that it bordered on madness. The Zero's construction seemed to violate every principle of aircraft safety that Allied engineers held sacred. The fuel tanks had no self-sealing protection, no rubber coating that would close around bullet holes. There was no armor plating behind the pilot's seat, nothing protecting the engine, and no bulletproof glass on the canopy. The airframe itself was built from ultra-thin aluminum alloy, some sections barely 0.5 mm thick, half the thickness of a standard Hawker Hurricane skin. When American test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders first flew the captured Zero at Naval Air Station North Island, his report was almost insubordinate in tone. "The aircraft feels like it might come apart if you sneeze. I've flown training biplanes that felt more solid." But then Sanders began testing the Zero's performance envelope, and the numbers made no sense. The A6M2 could sustain a turn at 4.5 Gs while maintaining energy, completing a full 360-degree turn in just 16 seconds at combat speed. By comparison, an F4F Wildcat needed 22 seconds, and even the later F6F Hellcat needed 19 seconds. The Zero could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute. Its range was an astounding 1,030 miles with external drop tanks, meaning it could fly from carriers 400 miles from target, fight for 20 minutes, and return home. No Allied carrier fighter could match that radius until late 1944. The revelation came when engineers finally weighed everything. The complete Zero fighter with guns, ammunition, radio, and full fuel weighed just 5'3", 13 pounds at takeoff. A fully loaded Grumman F6F Hellcat weighed 12,241 pounds. The Zero was flying with literally half the aircraft weight of its American opponents. The British Supermarine Spitfire MKV, considered lightweight by European standards, still weighed 6,622 pounds loaded. This weight obsession was embedded in every design decision. The Zero's Sakai 12 engine produced only 940 horsepower. The Hellcat's R2800 produced 2,000 horsepower. But the Zero didn't need power when it had eliminated everything heavy. Japanese engineers had calculated that maneuverability and range mattered more than pilot protection, more than durability, more than anything except the ability to reach the enemy and outfight them in a dogfight. The cultural reasoning behind this shocked Western analysts even more than the technical specifications. When interrogating captured Zero pilot Lieutenant Fujita Iozo after the Battle of Midway, American intelligence officers asked why Japanese designers eliminated pilot protection. Fujita looked confused by the question. "A samurai doesn't need armor," he said through a translator. "If you're skilled enough, you don't get hit. If you're not skilled enough, armor won't save you." This wasn't just warrior philosophy, it was calculated strategic thinking. Japan's industrial capacity was roughly 1/10 that of the United States. They couldn't build aircraft with 2,000 horsepower engines, thick armor plate, and self-sealing fuel tanks in meaningful numbers. Instead, they built fighters that could be manufactured with limited resources, while delivering maximum combat effectiveness in the hands of their highly trained pilots. The strategic genius of this approach became clear when examining early Pacific battles. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, Zeros flew 420 miles from carriers, fought for over an hour, and all returned safely, something literally impossible for any American carrier fighter in December 1941. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Zeros engaged American fighters at ranges where U.S. aircraft were already at the edge of their combat radius, forcing F-4F Wildcats to break off combat to preserve fuel for the return journey. But the Zeros' philosophy contained a fatal contradiction that would doom Japan's air campaign. The design worked brilliantly only with elite, highly trained pilots who could avoid being hit. When Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 kills, took a single .50 caliber round through his cockpit at Guadalcanal in August 1942, he was blinded in one eye and barely survived the 4-hour flight back to base. An American pilot with armor plating might have shaken off the same hit and continued fighting. As Japan's veteran pilots were killed and replaced with hastily trained recruits in 1943-44, the Zeros' lack of protection became catastrophic. New pilots couldn't avoid enemy fire through superior skill. A single .50 caliber incendiary round into the unprotected fuel tank would turn a Zero into a fireball. American pilots developed the grim nickname Zippo for Zeros, after the cigarette lighter, because they ignited so readily. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch, who developed the famous Thatch Weave defensive maneuver against Zeros, noted in his 1944 tactical memo, "The Zero is the most maneuverable aircraft in the sky, but it's also the most fragile. Don't try to turn with them. Extend away, use your speed and diving power, then boom and zoom. One good burst will do what 20 might not accomplish against a Hellcat." By 1944, the tables had completely turned. The F-6F Hellcat, with its massive engine, heavy armor, and self-sealing tanks, achieved an astounding 19.1 kill ratio against Zeros. American pilots could make mistakes, take hits and survive. Japanese pilots in Zeros could not. The most revealing comparison came from captured Japanese ace Saburo Sakai after the war. He flew a captured Hellcat at a demonstration in 1952 and was stunned. "It felt like flying a house," he said. "Heavy, solid, safe. In a Zero you flew like a bird, free, light, dangerous." The Hellcat pilot was inside a fortress. The Zero pilot was inside his own skill. He paused, then added quietly, "When I had skill, the Zero was better. When I was wounded and exhausted, I would have traded everything for that American fortress." The Zero's design philosophy, maximum performance through minimum weight, accepting catastrophic vulnerability, represented a strategic calculation that worked brilliantly for 18 months and then failed catastrophically. It taught Western engineers an uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes the best fighter isn't the one with the best specifications, but the one that matches your industrial capacity, pilot training pipeline, and strategic doctrine. The British and Americans built fighters that could lose battles and return to fight again. Japan built fighters that had to win every engagement, because losing once meant dying. In a long war of attrition, only one philosophy could survive.